Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Awaken Empowered podcast. I'm Micheila Sheldan. I'm here with Ethan Fox. One of the things I've been noticing in my private sessions as well as in my inner circle community is that a lot of people are starting over. We have a lot of first time awakenings going on across the planet where people are leaving third dimensional, familiar, and safe positions of work and moving into an entire new lifestyle and focusing on some spiritual endeavor. But we even have people here in the spiritual community who've been here for a very long period of time who are totally scrapping what they were doing before and moving into something brand new. And if there's anything that Ethan and I know very well, it's starting over and going through these big transitions in our lives. And I'm sure many of you out there are familiar with our stories. And if you're not, maybe we'll link some videos below where we've shared the details of our various awakenings. But for those who don't, this role in the world as a channel is not something I was very comfortable with. It really came into my life very unexpectedly. And as I began to awaken to channeling, my life was naturally taking a huge uncomfortable turn because I was very, very grounded in the third dimensional, societally approved constructs. I was married at the time. I had been a stay-at-home mom for 12, maybe 13 years. I was very ingrained in the community as a volunteer and had a really, really good life, financially and otherwise. But I think awakenings, they come at a very specific time to move us into the reality that we were always meant to be in. And it's not to say that what we're leaving behind is wrong. I think all of that definitely had a place, and I could certainly go back and trace all of the steps up until the period of my awakening and see how these various puzzle pieces fit into my current reality today. At the same time, I struggled a lot moving into a new life because the amount of fear and unknown, it can be quite overwhelming when you're leaving so many things behind. And I think it's natural, first of all, when we have these awakenings to also know that it's timed congruently to almost everyone else around us. This is something I've learned in my channeling, is that we have contracts with various family members and loved ones and friends. And typically when we're moving into a new phase of our life that's completely different, there's something about those contracts that's all equally timed to loosen up or change. And whether that's kids who are going off to college, which I notice a lot with some of the female clients that I have, or relationships are going through turbulence and there's an evaluation of a divorce, or there's a move across the country very unexpectedly and we find ourselves surrounded by people that we've never met before. These things are all facilitating change for us, and it's a universal experience. The universe is moving us from what was known to what is unknown in order for us to grow and evolve, but also I think assume very specific roles that we're all here to play out. The question is, how are we going to walk through it? And will we be a willing participant in where the universe wants to take us? And for me, that wasn't an easy thing. In holding on to my past, I really prolonged the process of stepping into the new, even though I didn't know every detail about what that path entailed. So I think that's one of the first mistakes that, it's natural for us to make, is we think we have to know everything about where we're going and we have to have the whole plan carved out in our minds before we really step onto the path. But what the universe is calling for us to do is to trust in the process and to take it day by day and piece by piece. And in so doing, my old reality totally collapsed and a new one was born. So the amount of resistance that I had to the old collapsing, I think for me is one of the regrets that I have in that timeline shift, because even just something like money, for example, that we talk about a lot on this podcast, it was something that I never should have struggled with in my mind. But the reality is, everything material that we've created that is held to our vibration is going to loosen up and somehow shift and change. And we'll go through a period of unknown. And for me, money was a big part of that. And I was holding on for dear life to all of the things that I felt were meant to be mine. And I had no idea that better things, better suited things in all areas were coming in. So the guides told me I had to surrender it all. And I think that's a really hard message for people in this community to hear, especially at a time like we're in today, where we do have so much uncertainty as a whole, as a collective, walking into challenging economic times, to surrender what we feel we have ownership to. But I can tell you 100%, the second I did that, the less I suffered and the more I was able to clarify the path forward and was supported, right? So I think support comes in really interesting and unexpected ways when we're willing to let go of the things that can't come with us into the next phase of our reality.
Like you, I've except for me, I think I've had very catastrophic life changes every 9 years of my life, and my life seems to follow numerology very well, so it makes it very predictable. Although this last one wasn't as catastrophic as many of the previous ones. But around just before I met you, actually, 10, 12 years ago, whatever that was, I went through a similar change. And where at that point, I had been in a relationship for 9 years, although we weren't married. It was pretty much like a marriage because we shared everything. We had combined bank accounts and everything. So it was the breaking up of that relationship was pretty much the same as a divorce would be. And at that time, I was very successful in the marketing, design, creative field at an agency in the local area with lots of furniture and stuff and employees who worked there as well. And I lived a pretty normal, mainstream, what appeared to the public to be a successful life. And at the same time, I had a lecture room where I held events regularly for people in the investing and trading space, and we were probably one of the very first at the time. Technology was still very new for doing virtual events, but we had people in the physical room, and we also broadcasted live online to people all over the world. So we had a pretty large audience internationally who were many of them were professional investors, and I taught classes occasionally, and we brought in teachers as well. So I was pretty successful in terms of what mainstream success people would think is successful. I had nice things. I had plenty of money, and at that time, everything was going smoothly. But I was coming to the end of my 9-year cycle, and of course that resulted in the breakup of that relationship, and as a result, or coincidental with that, was the loss of the business too, because the business sort of fell apart, disintegrated, and of course there was a global economic calamity that was happening at the same time. So it was my own cycles lined up with global financial cycles at that time. So as our business was failing or struggling, so was there was also an economic situation taking place. So all these things occurred. And in the course of a couple of years, I lost a relationship, shut down the business, and I had to move all this furniture home from the office building where we were located. And so suddenly I had my house full of all this office furniture, and then over the course of the year or so ahead, I proceeded to go broke. So from having everything and having lots of nice things and living that lifestyle to complete opposite within the span of a couple of years, and also being by myself, alone again in terms of the relationship. So it's a very catastrophic change, and in that transition, I lost my car. I lost, most of my home furniture. So I had almost nothing in the house other than all the office furniture that I brought home, which was cluttering up the whole house. So I basically filled the house back up with office furniture. So for the longest time, my place looked like an office building, basically. And in the beginning, I thought, well, I can just, when I started going broke slowly, I decided I'm just going to sell furniture because I had it and I didn't need it. So I started selling furniture to make ends meet and to keep going. And many people who have been around in my early years know these stories already. In those years, I didn't even have a car, so I was walking places, or people would pick me up and take me places. And I also lost my entire circle of people, because in my circle of people were the people who I worked with, and also my relationship, all the friends that were associated with that. Lost all of that. So it was basically, I was starting my entire life over. I had nothing really, very little shreds of what the former life was. Now, I still had the investing group, though, the trading investing group. And in that group, I had a lot of respect, and people, even at years later, when I shut the group down, I'd run into them and they'd say, everybody's talking about this group and wish you would bring it back. So I could have, and at the time that I decided to close that down as well, it was because I was having a spiritual awakening simultaneous to all of these physical world changes. And in that spiritual awakening, I realized I can't go back. And I had plenty of connections in the investing space from various organizations and brokerage houses who we had worked with in our education platform. And I was even on the verge of putting together a global, or a trading conference, an investing trading conference for more professional, sophisticated investors. So all of this was being planned at that very ending stage of my former life. And had I continued, I would have put on an investing conference instead of the Awaken Empowered Expo, which I ended up doing a year and a half later. So you can see that dramatic shift in consciousness caused me to, even though in my third dimensional carbon-based life, in a manner of speaking, I was going to put on a conference, but the shift in consciousness changed it from a trading investment conference to a consciousness-based conference. So there was that shift that took place. But so in the interim, so I realized I could go back in terms of career choice. I could, even if it was temporarily, I could get a job at a brokerage firm or something, and I would probably be making the same amount of money, or more than I was before, and that would have been okay, at least for now. But I made the decision then that I can't go back into that former life because of the new awareness that I had, and as a result, I chose to not have money for that period of time, and reached a point where I had very little or no income, and almost nothing left in terms of savings and stuff and anything like that. And so I sold furniture, finally couldn't do that anymore, and got to a point where, initially I was a little concerned because although I had had times in my life previously where I didn't have much money, it had been quite a while since that had occurred. So going through this again, initially there was a lot of concern and fear over that potential. But when I made the decision that I wasn't going back to my former life, and that the only way was forward to whatever this future consciousness-based, spiritually based future was that I didn't know at the time, whatever that is, that's what I have to do. And even if that meant I was going to be homeless or broke for a while. And so I made that decision, and even came to the place where the concern went away, and I simply accepted the circumstances I was in, which was, well, I could be homeless soon. And I decided that's okay. And even started planning for that, planning for, well, I'll just put all of my belongings into storage, and I'll sell it off and get the money together and find the most beautiful place in the world I could go and be homeless. And I will just go there and be homeless. And that was the decision that I made. And so I was within a month of making that decision at that point. And no sooner than I made that decision, it was, in a manner of speaking, we talk about a lot of this in law of attraction circles and such, about resistance and such. And I find that to be true in my own life, because I spent my whole life focusing on success and, earlier, in my life, material wealth and things like that. But the problem is when we have so much fear and resistance to that thing, it tends to limit the potential. But the moment you let go of the resistance, whatever potentials you built up tend to push through, right? Especially if it's in alignment with your soul's journey. And no sooner than I accepted in a manner of speaking, I don't want to say excited for being homeless, but curious and interested, and thought that wouldn't be such a bad life. If I had to sit on a park bench in some beautiful place in the world and be homeless, I'd figure it out and that would be okay. And maybe I would sell enough of my belongings to have enough cash to buy some basic food and basic needs, and that would be all right. So as soon as I embraced that life, everything shifted in my life. And suddenly I started, I was on the first telesummit back then. And, up to that point, we were doing energy transfers locally, right? So my consciousness shift led me to make this decision to move in this direction. And we started doing energy transfer events. And soon after, I met Barb and met you. And of course, in the first years of energy transfer events, there was no money coming in. It was just something I was doing as an experiment, and because I, out of faith, knew this was the direction I needed to go, but had no plans to make any money doing it, or to find any way of providing for myself. So I was just simply doing it in faith that this was the direction I was supposed to go, that I wasn't going to go back to the financial space. And so that went on for a few years. Barb would pick me up and drive me there. You would pick me, or somebody would pick me up and drive me there because I had no car. And for the first couple of years, that's what we did. And in that period of time, I also was contemplating being homeless any day. But when I finally embraced being homeless, everything shifted, and suddenly, I had clients again. And we started doing more events and started doing them virtually, was interviewed on different shows, and of course started our YouTube channel as well, initially podcast interviews and things like that. And slowly I made my way back. And until several years later, I was doing even better than I ever was before in my former life. But the thing is, I think we have to get to that point where we are willing to, in faith, embrace the direction we're going based on the signs that we're seeing in our lives. And the problem, I think, with a lot of our journey is that we have so much resistance in the way that we can't see what's right in front of us. And so we tend to either backtrack and go back to what we were doing before because it's safe, or we may go forward doing something new that's really a backtrack, even though it might look, packaged as something new in a new direction, and it just another version of the old thing that we were doing. So I think oftentimes we have to embrace the possibility of not knowing where we're going, but follow the signs and make the best decision we can. And eventually everything will work out if we do that.
The point that you made about the people, I think that is so important. And recently what we've learned through the guides is that, the source field, it's so intangible to us. We imagine it like this mysterious place that's, feeding us things that we need. But really here on planet Earth, we all make up the source field. So the more we step into our truth, the more that field is going to rearrange itself around us. And I personally believe that God, universe, works its way through the hands, the voices, the bodies of everyone else in our lives. So the fact that you didn't have a car and people were picking you up and driving you, I know I personally was dropping off food at that time for you, right? People come in and do these things. But what happens is we all often overlook that that's a resource that we need because we're still stuck on the fact that we're not providing it for ourselves. And I think that's one of the big shifts that we have to contemplate and really get into when we're going through these lifetime changes. We may not have things coming in the exact way we knew before or how we expect, but they're always going to be there to the degree that we need to walk that bridge from one reality to the next. So the least amount of resistance that we have, the more we're going to see those things and they're going to show up more clearly for us and we won't suffer, right, so much through it. But what you said about business is a really interesting example, because in the book, the guides say an entire business group or agreement or contract will fall apart at the exact moment that every party is meant to go in opposite direction and take advantage of something else. And we're always so quick to place the blame on, people or circumstances or even ourselves, when the universe is orchestrating this change so perfectly for us that if we don't fall to some level of grace with that, we're always going to struggle. So in my situation, very similar, but I had a lot of interesting people come in. And at a time when I was in so much fear of taking this path, I had you and many others who would never have let me not take the path, meaning, they were showing up to drag me along and to provide opportunities for me, whether, it was the first expo and getting out in front of people, which I had never planned and would have never done, had a big mistake not happened with the speaker before who was supposed to be on stage channeling, right? All those things, you look back and you just see the beautiful synchronicities, right, that show up. But I was in a very conventional neighborhood, actually a golf course community. I was married to a CFO, very successful man, very good father. But when I began to channel and I stepped into this world, he couldn't accept or understand these changes that were going on in me. And of course, as you can imagine, as I know many out there are experiencing, my peer group, my family, it was very, very misunderstood. But simultaneously, I had people coming into my life who were talking about channeling at a time when I didn't even know what it was. I also had, you and Barb and, a variety of others who were speaking the language of the guides. And I had the guides themselves coming in and telling me that I was here on a mission and I was meant to channel in front of audiences, which I wanted absolutely no part of. And I know a lot of people out there are also receiving these messages, and that in and of itself can be extremely scary when you're told you have a mission and you believe you haven't been serving it to date. And then you look at how many years you have left in order to accomplish this major goal that they're presenting to you. And you think, my gosh, I have to get going. But what I've learned in most of the work that I've done, especially the private sessions, is that we're always here offering something very important to the collective that's a part of our mission. It's just that we've suppressed it somewhat dimensionally and vibrationally. So the roles that we've perceived in the third dimension may not have been the highest and best expression of how we're here to serve, but they still count, right? And I think we have to get that out of the way, because if we're always looking back at what we've done before and think we were wrong or we've made all these mistakes and we've had this limited expression of our soul, that also puts this huge burden, I think, on us to be perfect and heal before we set in motion all of the things that we're learning we're capable of doing. And this comes up also a lot in my transmissions, is that unless we truly believe in ourselves and forgive ourselves for what we think we did wrong, we're never going to set off on that new trajectory in a way that it really does serve. So a lot of that communication and suppression and resistance, it really starts within us. But it's hard when you don't have the people around you mirroring back, the trust and the faith that you're supposed to find inwardly. And I see a lot of people today that are in that situation. They know that things have happened that they can't explain. Either they're channeling or they're doing some form of healing work, but they don't have the people around them yet that are able to validate for them or take them on that journey. And I think that it's a wonky time, right now on planet Earth, because there are periods when we're rebirthing that, like you said, we find ourselves alone. And I think that is extremely purposeful. And for me, that was a period of channeling in my closet and not telling anyone, because I personally didn't believe it myself, nor understood what it was. And while that time, if I look back, might seem difficult, I kind of have a fondness for, the very beginning of that journey where I was alone and I was on a quest and a mission to better understand and to cultivate the wisdom to really get on the path. And I see a lot of people who are there now, whether you've been in this world for a long period of time or you're just awakening to something brand new. If you find yourself alone, it's purposeful. Like Mary says, it's going into the cave, or stripping away all of the things that we are not to uncover the truths of who we're yet to become. And I think that does take literal linear time. But I did mention in the last podcast about relationships that sometimes when we're awakening, those relationships can be very otherworldly and cosmic and confusing. And that's kind of inevitable. I know you had that situation with your energy transfers, running into some people that, helped to validate those, and even Barb, right? I had the same thing, a lot of otherworldly, you and I for sure, otherworldly, strange connection that came out of nowhere that was extremely purposeful. And I think as we move into the next several years, we're going to see more of that. And I've talked about this a little bit in some of our podcasts. The guides call it a grand reorganization. I think over the last several years, as we've gone through this challenging time, it's been purposeful that we've been around a lot of people maybe who haven't been so awakened, because our vibration is always making an impact, right, on everything and everyone in our surroundings. But now those magnets are starting to fire a little bit differently. And I feel everyone's ready to prepare, or in preparation and ready to up level in their work. And that means calling in, brand new people that are going to lead us in some way or strengthen our relationship with ourselves and our gifts in some important way as well. And it can be confusing, when you first break open to something like channeling or like what you do, energy transfers. What the guides always recommend is open sourcing it for a while. And there's many reasons for that. In the fifth dimension, we're working with a new form of source. It isn't the old monetary material system. It's not that we don't earn money and we aren't supported, but those false paths to earning and working hard and success, those ideals, just like you said, you couldn't go back to who you were before. Those can't come with us into the new. So we see very clearly through a conscious lens all of the things that we've been working within that aren't really for our betterment. And an open source model, and we talk about this a lot, it really it creates the foundation for and the structure for whatever you're creating in the future. If it's going to be some type of spiritual business or offering or collaboration, when we have people coming to us and we're simply providing something with no expectation, just for the feedback and the understanding of how it benefits their lives, we will inevitably grow in that understanding to the point where we get to create it according to how the universe is showing us it works, because there's no one who can tell you that. And even though I do a lot of sessions where the guides come in and they'll explain in detail the gifts and abilities that someone came to the earth with, there's no instruction manual for when you're here figuring that out. I think you really have to put it into application, and it isn't perfect. It's not going to be the final iteration of what you're here to do. And in fact, I think it's going to change a million times, because if I look back at my path of channeling, I've honed it more and more and more as I've gone along, mainly because of the feedback that I get from people and how it's valuable and how it's best impacting their lives. And that aligns with all of the downloads and the intuition and the communication from the guides to help me ground this path of spiritual offering, which again is a constant. And I think people are changing it right now because some of that third dimensional sticky stuff came, with us along the way. I can't tell you how many times I've heard in session that people are using a specific modality or they're leaning on a technology, and it's not really what they're here to do, because we use the linear mind to construct a third dimensional expression of what our higher dimensional gifts and abilities actually are. And it helps us to lean on something really rational, I think, and concrete. But what I've learned is the farthest you can take this, whatever it is you do, the better. For me, that was getting on stage in a trance and channeling for people having absolutely no idea that it was ever going to work. And that was scary. And I think getting into that discomfort and fear is really where the magic happens. And it's not just in the spiritual offering or gifts. For me, that involved leaving behind a relationship that I had been in for 20 years. I had 2 young children. That was definitely not an easy journey. And I went from the fancy golf course community to a temporary apartment. I couldn't get a lease. I couldn't get a mortgage. I had been a stay-at-home mom, hadn't worked in the professional world in many years, and had to figure all of that out, which was essentially timing. The path opened up and the people came in that supported me to get what I needed, the more I released who I was before. So the expectation of how the new stuff looks in the framework of the third dimension can really get us in trouble. I think sometimes, whether it's the relationship, our living expectations, the living quarters we're going to be in, the material that's going to surround us, and how what we're putting out in the world has to look very rational and somehow match the vibration of what we were doing before. We put it so much in the framework of success. And I see that still in the spiritual community. And I think that has to die. It has to die with the third dimension, because it carries us out of the integrity. And I've said this before, of what's meant to come through. And as a channel, I'm sure we have channels out there. It's scary to sit in front of a group of people and not know what's going to come out of your mouth, or if it's going to make sense, or people are going to find an impact with it. But the more you put yourself in those scary situations, the more you're going to find the universe supporting you, and you're going to become someone new in the process, because your confidence will grow. Even though I still question every time I have to get in front of a live audience and channel, because it's just a natural instinct in me. The person that I am today is completely different than who I was before. How I look at the world is completely different. And not to say there's anything wrong with material, or having a big house or any of those things. But I remember a breaking point in my spiritual awakening where I lived in a beautiful home and I was looking around at all of the lights, and I was counting the number of light bulbs in the house. And I remember thinking, nobody needs this many light bulbs. and a part of me just had a really hard time accepting that this was the right reality for me personally. And I think that's because when we go on these spiritual quests and we awaken and we shift our reality, we're becoming more purposeful and more intentional, where everything that we possess, everything that we own, the places that we live, it's not about the money or the material necessarily, but it's about everything having its purpose and intention that relates back to what you're doing or who you have become. And that's been more simplicity, truly, for me. Without all the excess, the things that weigh me down that really don't have a true energetic purpose in my life anymore.
Yeah, you mentioned open source, right? And so I think you mentioned some points about my own life journey, which I want to sort of elaborate on, which I think illustrates that point really well. A lot of people, especially in this spiritual space, think that we could have a barter-based system, for example. But bartering is not really open source, in my opinion, because bartering, you have an expectation of return. If you are bartering a fur coat for, I don't know, something else, you have an expectation you're going to get something else. So it's an exchange that's taking place. Whereas in our global economic environment, we can't really, bartering is not a means of exchange that can actually work. If I need to buy a camera from somebody, let's say a Panasonic camera, and then I can't do an energy transfer for the company Panasonic to or Amazon or whoever to give me a camera in exchange, even if the dollar amounts I charge may be equivalent to the camera, or I can't do 10 energy transfers for a camera. Nobody's going to do that. Or the internet service that where we do our live streams, I can't pay them doing energy transfer. So we can't, bartering doesn't work. We need to have some sort of dollar or some kind of universally accepted means of exchange, especially these days electronically. But what you're talking about, open source, is a little bit different in that, to use my own life as an example, as you started to do so earlier, when I went from my former life to that transitional period where I started doing energy transfers, I lost all the people in my life that I knew, all the staff and family and friends, everybody kind of fell off the wayside. Even a lot of members of my own family also went kind of transition at that time. And suddenly I was going in this new direction in faith, and I was starting to do energy transfers to the local library, and I met Barb's, who, we were doing that. And the thing is, I had no expectation of return. I had no car. I had very little material wealth to speak of. And as you said, you were dropping groceries off at my house because you thought I was going to starve to death. So the thing is, you don't have to ask for those things. If you are in alignment with your soul's journey and you have non-resistance to that, or little resistance, then you'll be pulled in the direction you need to go, and the people and resources will show up. So in those initial years, I had a team of people who were initially helping with energy transfers and then planning the expo. And, at first, if you look at it on the surface, I had all these volunteers who were helping me do this thing that was a vision that I was moving toward, that I was being pulled toward. But I wasn't paying anybody, and if I were to go back to my former life where I had an office building and employees, I paid everybody to be there every day. They showed up because I paid them. Of course, they enjoyed their work too, I imagine. But in this new direction I was going, I wasn't paying anybody. So even though, on the one hand, I really had very little material wealth and I had very little cash flow, and on the verge of being homeless any day, I had all of these people who were working for free. And a lot of them, specialize in their own fields of work that they normally would charge people for. They were doing for free because they felt like they belonged to this mission, this direction that I was going. I didn't actually advertise for it. A lot of times people just showed up and walked up to me in events and said, hey, I want to help you with this. And that's what you're talking about with open source, is I had people driving me around to places I needed to be. I had people doing the marketing. You were helping with the marketing initially when I first met you. Barb was helping at energy transfer events. I had a person on the team who was a web designer who designed the initial websites and built them, and staff members who helped run the first expo. And another thing with regard to the expos, I was planning the first expo right after going through this period of transition where I was broke and had no way to pay for an expo. And yet something in me pulled me forward. So I knew it was a direction I needed to go. And yet I had no reason for doing it because it was a totally irrational, if you look at it purely from a left brain practical perspective, it was an irrational decision to plan a conference when I've never done a conference before like that. Secondly, I was newly in the spiritual space, and I had no money. I had no money. But I had all these volunteers who were helping me plan this expo that I had no money to pay for. And somehow it all came together, and the expo happened anyway. It lost money, and so I was even more broke after the first expo than I was before the first expo. And yet I started planning the next one. And year after year, we kept doing it. And circumstances just worked out, even though not a single one of any expo actually made money. But each one actually led to other opportunities and clients and other avenues through which financial resources came in. But I wasn't actually looking for that, and I think that's a thing we often get stuck. In my former self, where I was running an agency and in the financial space, I was looking for money. I was working in lines of work where people paid me to do things I did, or I was investing and I was expecting a return on that. So there was always this expectation of return. Whereas after that big transition, I went through a period of time where I had no expectation, but people showed up and provided all these services. And even some of them chipped in money or their computers or laptops or other things that they had that we needed in order to make those first expos happen. And these are all things that in my former life I would have had to pay for. So in many respects, my cash flow or my wealth actually hadn't changed because I was paying for all the same stuff. What changed was my perception because I didn't have the dollars in the bank, but nothing had actually changed. And so I'd simply transitioned to what you're calling an open source revenue or income, and where in a state of non-resistance, the universe simply provided what I needed in order to go forward on the life I was meant to live. And that went on for many, many years until I started having the cash flow again. And then the cash flow covered the cost of the expo and everything, which essentially I was paying to do it year after year. So it was an interesting journey in my own learning in terms of being in a state of non-resistance. And I think a lot of times because we are in a state of resistance. And I attribute resistance also to having the perspective of who we were in the past. For example, if I had gone back into an investment field, that would have been more resistance because I would have been going back to something that was safe in my mind at the time. But instead of going into the unknown in faith, I was simply accepting and being in a state of non-resistance to allow my new life to take shape on its own, and whatever that was. And I had no idea what it was then. I didn't know how I was ever going to generate income from a spiritual field, or how I was going to pay for conferences that I couldn't afford to put on in the first place. And yet, allowing the universe or my own life journey to pull me forward, all those pieces just fell into place, and eventually the money came too. So, but when the money came, I had reached a point where I didn't, although I needed the money to pay for the conferences and whatnot, I had also accepted being homeless as a potential. And that acceptance of being homeless freed me from the concern over what could happen if I didn't have it. And then when it came, there was not as much resistance to it as I had previously in my former life had. So I think the open source income or open source way of living really has more to do with us moving forward in non-resistance. And when you move forward in non-resistance, the universe is going to provide whatever you had arranged for in the first place, whether that be people resources or whether that be financial resources or whether that is that things just happen to work out for you. I think a lot of times when we are constantly hitting up against walls or obstacles, it's because we're trying to go in a direction we're not meant to go. Unless, of course, those walls are there to teach us certain things and we need to learn from those things, and that's possible too. But I think in many people's situations, they're trying to struggle with, especially when you're making a big shift from a mainstream mindset and career and lifestyle to a non-mainstream, to an alternative one. it can be a big change because your whole mental, emotional constructs are based on what society has told you it's supposed to be, and suddenly you have to walk into this space that people are going to think you're a little weird sometimes too. And secondly, there's no foundation; you just have to make it up. But I think open source really has to come with non-resistance, because you can't have open source with resistance, because it never works. You have to be in a non-resistant state, in faith going forward, watching and observing the signs, and whatever people you need, if you need any, to do what you're going to do, will show up and will be there to help you. And a lot of times we don't place enough value on that and realize, oh, well, that person is providing these products and services for me for free, where previously I would have paid for that. And that is cash flow, even though it doesn't look like dollars in the bank account. So I think that's an important observation that we need to have when we're going through these transitional phases, that we're always supported, but it's our own resistance to that movement in the new direction that creates all the suffering. And if we can get to that point where we can embrace not knowing and just move forward in faith because you know it's the right path, and just allow whatever to be, it'll all just unfold, and the people will show up, the money will show up, or whatever you need will show up to take care of you when you need it.
The interesting thing about that is I think we don't often see the synchronicities at the time that they're coming in, but then we look back and we see the beauty of the path and how it took shape. And that has been huge for me. I started this journey in chronic pain. My family made a move across town. I found myself in a neighborhood where I couldn't make friends or keep the same level of activity volunteer wise that I was used to. And it's like the guides call it like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. You can only do it for so long, and it's going to bob up to the top because you're trying to do something that you're really not meant to do. And so you're just blocked at every turn. And I went through that, personally. I had a degree in marketing. And I worked very successfully in the marketing field for a good number of years before I left that world to become a stay-at-home mom. So it was natural for me when my kids got older to start to go back into that marketing direction. And I created my own business and had a few contracts, but it just really was a struggle. And to be honest, I absolutely hated it. I thought it was something I should be doing. I love the principles of marketing. I love the creativity of marketing, but how I was doing it in the world was just such a daily struggle for me. And that's actually how we met. I'd started meditating, and I was exposed to some spiritual, ideas and principles. I had started watching all kinds of videos and really found myself very alone. And one Saturday was just searching online for an event that looked interesting and fun to me. And I saw one of Ethann's energy transfers. And, at the time I just offered to do some PR for the expo because it was just what I did, but became so excited at the potential of putting my gifts and abilities into something that was more meaningful to me. So it's really easy for me to leave the business behind that wasn't working out so well. And, at the same time, of course, I was doing all of the channeling. So the people are key, and we don't really see that until we get to the other side. But what you're saying about open source is also so true, because what I found, this is just at the very beginning of my shift, was that I was counting every penny. I think, anyone, especially females who are out there who've been through a divorce, probably understand this, that there's this level of fear around surviving day to day. And I used to go into my bank account every day and add up how many days I had worth of living before I would run out of money, which is the absolute wrong thing to do. But in the interim, what I've learned is you just cannot set up a spiritual business or a mission anywhere near what you know in the third dimension. And especially for me, the big focus has been on time, because I'm a doer. I've always been highly successful at everything I do. I put in my all. But when you're working with energy, there's only so much that you can sustain. And in the fifth dimension, you're really floating on that open source, kind of like a wave. And that's what I found. So in putting my channeling out to the world freely, I was starting to get all kinds of opportunities. So people wanted private sessions. Just like you, I was invited on a telesummit. I was offered opportunities to have interviews done, and I came up with my first course, right? And so all of those things, even though some of them didn't bring in money, but they were exposing me to an audience. They were free marketing. They were all spawned from my open source model. And the second you start trying to do that in the physical plane, you're going to fall on your face, because we aren't really meant to seek out those opportunities necessarily like we've been taught. So certainly I had those skills in the third dimension. I was a PR assistant for a hospital in my area. I had worked in marketing all the way up to marketing director for an environmental firm. I was used to making things happen. But in a spiritual business model, it's more like you follow the intuition and the voice of spirit to do the things that you know are right. And then all of the right things tend to happen because you do that. And I had to get out, as I mentioned, of the time and the measurement of time, because working an 8-hour, 9-hour day, 5 days a week, it just doesn't make sense, because to be inspired to create something in a channeled model, it's not anything you can force on a schedule. It's not anything that can come because you need money, because the second you do that, you're going to find yourself hitting up against walls, right? And so I learned very quickly that I had to erase the memory, the cellular memory, and the limitations of all of those belief systems, because I was just running around like a chicken with my head cut off and truly getting more and more exhausted, which I think is the body's way of saying you need to stop, right? Because there's an intelligence that knows better than you. The process that's being birthed through you is more important than what the mind is wanting to put in place, right? And so that for me has been really beautiful as well, because it's freed up my life to live in such a different way. I mean, I don't feel like I'm working because I love what I do. And what I do has a rhythm to it such that it comes when it's necessary. And when it's not here, I've learned not to stress about it. And I think that's the other piece is it's natural, I think, for us, especially those who are very gifted in using, various modalities like this, to freak out when it's not coming, and we think, oh, I've lost it. I've lost the connection. It's not here. The guides know, the universe knows exactly when there's something important that has to come through you, or come from within you. You're a conduit, right? And to me, that means I'm not doing this alone. I'm doing it on behalf of so many others who are, they have more information, they have more insight as to the timing and, what's going on the planet, and truly what's going on within the collective. So all I have to do is sit back and wait for it to arrive. And when I do that, it always does. It always does arrive in the perfect way, in the perfect time, to impact people at the way that they need, in the way that they need. And I know I could never do that on my own. So getting out of your own way, I think, is really huge in a fifth dimensional timeline. But not easy by any means.
I think the hard part for a lot of us is we were raised in a very conventional mainstream society where the structures were already there,
right,
to benefit the few at the top, for people to follow the same path. And of course, our parents raised us in that environment with their belief system that you go to school, you go to college, you get a degree, you get a job, you work there for the rest of your life, you get married, you have kids, and that's how life is. And none of us realize until now we're starting to realize in more modern times that this system was created to benefit the few, and really has stifled everybody's creativity and individuality. And our own self-empowerment has been stifled in that structure. I mean, in society really in general, but that structure I think is a huge part of it. Of course, it starts in our early schooling, because in schooling we are trained to grow up to be, to be people who follow the person in front of the room, and to follow the CEO, or to follow a boss or whatever. And so we grow up in this conventional model. The problem I think in society today is that the conventional models are collapsing. They're struggling now because of they've reached sort of their extreme, and they're starting to fall apart. And as they are, people are losing their jobs, or they're making these transitions. A lot of people have spiritual awakenings, and as a result, the conventional model makes no sense anymore, as in our case years ago. But the problem is there's no rule book for the new thing, because our parents didn't teach us anything,
Right.
and society didn't teach us anything. We are writing those books. We are the pioneers in this new thing, to make this shift to a higher state of consciousness, and then finding that our entire lives we were trained to function in that third dimensional reality where the rat race that everybody else belongs to. And suddenly we have to not only reinvent ourselves, but also reinvent our role in the world. And how do we live in a third dimensional to fifth dimensional reality where we may still need some sort of financial resource to function in third dimensional structure, but meanwhile we're operating in a fifth dimensional consciousness. And that's tough because nobody taught us how to do that. And that's where a lot of times I think it takes that faith to move forward into the unknown without falling victim to your own preconceptions about that third dimensional reality and what works there. So that I think is one of the biggest challenges that we have, is to be willing to have the faith to follow that path. And I mean, in my case, it was particularly challenging too, because I had spent my entire life as an entrepreneur or in the financial space. So I had a lot of very rigid third dimensional structures and models. Now, my one thing that maybe I did right in my earlier life was I never really was much of an employee. So although there are brief periods of time where I had a job, on the whole, jobs just didn't resonate with me. And any jobs I had were meaningless, trivial jobs that I could easily quit and move on. I never worked in a corporate environment other than when I had my own businesses. And so I really wasn't indoctrinated into that corporate mindset as much as I think a lot of people are. And as a result, I think it was easier for me to break out of it in the mental construct sort of way. And I think that's where we have to really be more self-aware of our tendency to fall into that conventional model, even though we may think we're not. Maybe we shift from a corporate world to a spiritual world where now we're doing sessions and making money doing sessions. I think that's fine if the direction you're going is something that is in alignment with your soul's purpose. But a lot of times I see people, for example, who may go from working in the medical field as a nurse to now being a Reiki master. And as I've talked many times in the previous decade, we're all here for unique things. But because we are trained at a young age to all fit into the same box, nobody explores that. But I find that all throughout our lives, that unique thing or those unique things have always been there. They're always kind of peeking out from the corners, but we don't notice because we're still trying to do the conventional thing that everybody expects us to do. But for me personally, those unique things were always there. When I look back over my life, healing abilities, I had at a very young age, although I never took it very seriously back then. I just thought it was a coincidence. A lot of the energy phenomena that was happening around me when I was in my teens and 20s even. attributed them to just coincidence or random occurrences. But if you look back over your life, you see it was always there. So I could have, in a different world, in a fifth dimensional world, if my parents had also been fifth dimensional, they probably would have started me on that healing journey at a young age, as being moving in that direction. But because we have grown up in a third dimensional world and moving into a fifth, those structures weren't there to teach us those things, to teach us to develop our unique talents and abilities and discover our soul's purpose. And so later on in life now, we have to create those for ourselves without any guidance in many cases from others who have done it before or who have existed in that fifth dimensional space and can tell you how to do it. So that's, I think, the tricky part of where we are as a world today is as consciousness expands and people go through their awakening experiences and they go through these major transitions that as we've been discussing, they are going into a world, into a consciousness that did not exist when we were growing up. And because of that, we have to invent it. And I see so many people just falling back into the conventional mindset and going the safe route by doing what everybody else is doing. Whether that be Reiki or buying some product or modality and selling that to somebody else, instead of looking within to see what am I here to do and what has always been there since I was born that maybe I didn't pay a lot of attention to because I was too busy doing this conventional thing. And that's where I think we need to go. And that requires a lot of faith and trying new things that are uncomfortable and putting ourselves out there in front of people, doing things that maybe we don't feel 100% comfortable doing, or maybe even a little embarrassed or shy to do, because who are we to say we can do that? I know even in your case in channeling in the early stages, and maybe even today, you question, who am I to be a channel? Or who am I to be doing what I'm doing, right? But you have to have the faith to do it without ego. Now, I think there are plenty of people out there who have very strong egos who are out there in the spiritual space who are doing it just for monetary gain or for fame or both. That's a different situation. But if you go forward in faith without attachment to what you're doing, then I think you can create this new thing. And then future generations who grow under our guidance will have an easier path because they won't grow up in this cubicle society where we're all being uniformly trained to fit into a societal structure that provides for a handful of people who are the wealthiest in the world. So we are at that pivotal stage, I think, right now as a global society, inventing something entirely new that didn't ever exist before. And it may take many generations before I think it becomes established enough to where kids will just be trained from a young age to do that. But the challenge and the exciting part about where we are as a society today is we get to create that. But it takes faith, it takes non-resistance, and the willingness to go in that direction.
There's a lot of distractions out there too for people who are starting off in a new direction, especially a spiritually focused direction, especially with technology and social media. And I think it's a really huge waste of time and energy, even though it seems the popular and most successful approach to put out TikTok videos and to put out fancy reels and to have a sales strategy. And, I see it all the time. You do not need to do that if you are truly coming from the heart. It's the sign of the times. We talked a little bit about Chiron and Aries, right? It's the ego, the sign of the times. But if we're focused on doing all of that stuff in order to succeed, we are pulling ourselves away from the truth and the authenticity of what our soul came here to express. But I've also seen the opposite. There are a lot of people out there with a lot of integrity that are incredibly gifted, but shy away from putting it into the world because they don't want to appear as if their ego is inflated, or they're asking that question, why me? And what the guides have said is that we we humble ourselves every time we're able to provide something of service to another. And it's just a slightly different way of looking at, putting yourself out there. If you're always putting something into the world that's going to serve others without any condition around it, sales being a condition, right? Attention, likes, views being a condition, then you will find that your service is going to have a variety of different pathways, authentic pathways to reaching others that will serve you so that you can put out more freely into the world. And that's what we've always done is the more we put out freely into the world, the more that comes back to us such that we can invest more in the free stuff. And I think that's what we're really all going for here. But if we were to get lost in doing all of the things that a lot of people out there are focused on, the TikToks and the shorts and all of this stuff. Not that, listen, if you're doing that for service and you're really putting out good content that helps people, I think that's amazing. But I think the bulk of it, 99% of it, the intention behind it is for attention, right? Or for sales. We always have to look at the intention behind everything and become very meticulous, I believe, with that intention. And that's what the fifth dimension is all about. So, beyond the fact that we are being called from the collective to do something that is going to not be our timing, we're also being asked to very closely review our intention and purpose behind everything that we do. And that's something that we've recently been learning through the Ascended Masters and a lot of the channeling that I've been doing. They were meticulous in thought, in word, and in act. And we aren't perfect necessarily, and I don't think we have to be perfect, but when we're conscious, we're catching those rough edges that still have to be smoothed out from the old model that we still may be holding on to, right? And that's the key. I think when we're conscious and we're really present with what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it, we're always going to see where those little inauthentic intentions or even limiting beliefs are contaminating the container through which our work is shared. And I'm always on top of that with myself, not perfect. I've found myself putting out content at times because I think, well, I haven't put any content out for a while. And then I think, oh, that's okay. I have to keep checking myself because there's a lot of societal pressure these days, even in the spiritual community. I think there's a lot of pressure to be seen and to be successful and to have a model that looks a certain way. But I think we have to dare to go against some of that in order to rebalance what's going on here, in the collective and in our world, because ultimately, if we're here to be of service and we have a purpose-driven model, those things that will bring the attention and the followers, that stuff is going to happen organically. That just like we've talked about the source field, the right people will show up. Well, the right opportunities are going to show up. And the people who are meant to receive whatever you have to offer are also going to be drawn. And what I've had to come to in my work, which is tough because it's a very vulnerable channel, any spiritual modality, it's a vulnerable thing to do. Not everyone's going to like what you're doing. And not everyone is here on the planet to be a part of what you're doing at all times. And that's something I've really had to put into my constant evaluation of my work to know I'm changing, the world is changing, the messages are going to change, and the people surrounding those messages also have to change. And I can't take that personally, because if I do, that's another thing that gets put in the way that doesn't serve the work.
Yeah, that was for me. That I think that was one of the more challenging transitions because in my former life, speaking to some of the more conventional ways of thinking, right, sales and numbers and things like that, because in my former life, I was the CEO and the head of sales, so my job was to sell.
Yeah.
and to promote. And of course, I owned a marketing branding agency, so that's what we did.
Mm-hmm.
So I was the guy who went out and got the work for our company back then, and to go from that to where I am now was a big change, because initially you do care about the numbers, and you think that promotion is necessary to get you in front of people, and you've got to advertise and do these other things that everybody else does in the conventional world. But I realized over the years that none of that's really necessary, as you're saying, because if we are here on a path that we have planned as a soul to experience, then the resources always are going to be there. So you're basically just treading water, wasting time, focusing on trying to get numbers or trying to get the sales, because you're going to get whatever you need to get anyway, or you're not. And it doesn't really matter. You just have to follow the path in front of you and do the work that needs to be done. And so moving from that conventional mindset, because even as a young child, I was selling. I was in sales and in business even when I was, I don't know, 10, 12 years old, for school back then. And so that sales mindset started out, or that focus on money and the numbers. And to go from that to where nowadays I don't really worry about that. Do I look at the numbers? Sure. Do I concern over it? Less and less as time goes on, and just simply just do what there is to be done, and the resources that are meant to be will flow, and if you're doing the right thing. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't times in our lives, like in my case, where you may be meant to go broke. But if you're meant to go broke, no amount of it paying attention to the numbers is going to make any difference. You're still going to go broke. Now, maybe you'll go broke because you make some bad decision, or maybe you go broke because the global economic climate changes, as we're heading into a very difficult economic climate, and recent years and in the years ahead. A lot of people are going to experience that, right? But also in that economic climate, a lot of people are going to be perfectly fine. And the difference is, I think, some people, that may be an experience they chose to have at that time. I had that experience already many times in my life, so I'm familiar with what that feeling is like. And some people may just have chosen to have that experience, and if so, it's going to happen whether you like it or not. So there's no point in focusing on the numbers. I think you just get caught up in superficiality or attachment, and that never brings happiness. Even some of the most popular people in the world who have huge followings and lots of money tend to suffer the most, because they're all in a high state of resistance, even though they may be working every day to try to make the money to maintain their lifestyle. It doesn't really lead to happiness, and I think ultimately that's where we want to be, is to find ourselves in a state of contentment and joy and fulfillment in our lives, not focusing just to try to make money. And that's, I think, another aspect of society that we've gotten caught up in, which is we have to make a certain amount of money to have this certain lifestyle so that people respect us. Those are all models from the past that are holding us back from moving forward. So, a lot of moving forward means we have to be willing to let go of those things, and to also let go of what other people think of us, and just do what there is to be done anyway. Especially the last few years, I've, because I'm very outspoken about world things that are going on in the world these days, a lot of people don't like me as much as they used to in the past, right? And so I've also had to adjust this new way of being, whereas if I believe that something is true and that is for the best interest of other people, even if everybody disagrees with me, I have to say it anyway. And so you may find yourself in those situations where you have to go forward in faith, knowing what you know and doing the right thing, even if you know that the reception isn't going to be great at certain times. Because if it is the right path for you, you're going to head in the right direction anyway. And so in a similar way, if the struggles are financial for some people, if it's the right path for you, you'll end up in the right place anyway, even if for a period of time you struggle. And I think even in that financial state of struggle, if you can reach a state of non-resistance where you find contentment or even joy or even curiosity in that situation that you're in, you'll find that the resistance will go away and it'll make way for more opportunity to move forward. And that's been true for me when I look over my entire life. When I reach those states of non-resistance in my life are when things just flow more naturally. The people show up, the resources show up, and if needed, the money shows up too to do whatever I need to do. And we also need to understand that money is not something to be kept in a bank account. It is something that is a way through which source manifests itself to allow us to, in the current third dimensional to fifth dimensional reality we live in, allow us to make things happen in this material reality. So it is not something that's meant to sit in a bank account and just grow, although that's what we were taught. It is meant to flow. It is meant to flow to allow us to create, to allow us to build, to have things that contribute to our life in some meaningful way, and not meant to be hoarded or to be accumulated. Of course, there are people in the world who do hoard money, and as the guides have said in previous channel revelations show, we are all being sourced for them to have the ability to hoard wealth and power and so on. But that's not a fulfilling life either, because if they have to source us to have what they need, then they are just as much slaves as we are. And even though we are enslaved by them, they are also enslaved by us. So we live in a slavery society where even the most affluent people are slaves. And we have to move outside of that model. And in order to move outside of that model, we have to be willing to look at money in that way. Look at money as just a means through which source is expressing itself in this resistant dimension. In a less resistant dimension, we wouldn't have to have money in the way that we see money today. There would just simply be an exchange. Just like in the early years of this organization and the expo, people showed up to help. People showed up to drive me places. You dropped off groceries. I was providing service in my own way, and the universe was providing what I needed. And in that way, I was maintaining my life and doing something that was fulfilling and meaningful. And I had very little cash flow at all. And when you do have cash flow, that's meant to be used in order to fulfill the mission and the life journey you came here to have. Not something that we need to earn to put in a bank account. That's an important change of perspective, I think, that we need to have if we're going to move into a fifth dimensional consciousness.
You can't take it with you, right?
Right.
And I think just recently I've come into this pretty clear understanding of the source field through the guides. And the way I describe it is this. If God, universe, is an aspect of every soul, then soul is the template through which that energy flows. And each of us has a completely unique template. And as the light shines through that, it's creating a larger template, right? So the degree to which we show up in our authenticity and express who we uniquely are in the world, the more or the less people suffer, because we are providing an instrument of abundance here on the planet with whatever we're meant to do. So you can easily see how we've been taken out of the true source field by suppressing our uniqueness and our individuality. The more we try to be like someone else, or we're told we have to do something in order to fit into society, the source field is limited for everybody, not just for us. So we have to keep that in mind when we're creating our spiritual path or our business, whatever we call it. The more we look out at the world and we compare and try to be like someone else, the more we're limiting the source field for ourselves and every single other person on the planet. That's like a huge responsibility. But part of my journey in this channeling path was going from who am I to do this to who am I to not do this. And I think that if everyone were to take that and apply it to something that they can offer the world, that's where you find your sweet spot, because you get to the point where there's something that you know you're here to do that is of great value. But just like that beach ball held underwater, if you hold it too long, it's going to take more and more effort to keep it down. And I think that's where we've been for the longest time. So the more we free ourselves of any belief that we have to show up in a certain light, be a certain way, earn a certain amount of money, whatever that is, the more money, success, and all of that is going to come. And that is truly, I'm a testament to that. I truly believe through my path that that's what the universe and the guides have proven to me is the more I stay the course and I do what I'm here to do without doing it like anyone else, regardless of what anyone else thinks, which, some people aren't happy about that, but that's okay. That's okay. There are times that we're going to ebb and flow through our service model. And a lot of times what we find is that our personal paths ebb and flow with the collective, astrologically and otherwise. There are periods of dormancy that my service model goes through, and it's shown in my astrological chart. And it's typically a time when the planet's going through a little lull as well. And I can say from all the private sessions that I've done, I really see that about the spiritual community. I think as the earth is going through all of these changes, some of us have been, I don't want to say held back a little bit. I don't think we're ever purposely held back, but I think it hasn't been time yet for a lot of what we're here to do or express in the world to come to full fruition. And if we can fall into the belief of that and rest in that, I think we'll do far better, right, as we go through this transitional time, even though there's always going to be things to do and things to create. If we don't put too much stake on how that has to show up in the world a certain way, then we'll have a better experience individually and personally of the path that we're on.
Well, that's a good place for us to wrap up for today. Some of you have been asking about live streams, and we will be starting to do live streams again in the very near future, probably the next couple of months. Barb has been out on a health leave temporarily, so soon as she's up and running, we will resume our Facebook live streams as well. And of course, the videos we'll put out on YouTube and other platforms. As usual, you can find us on various podcasts like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And we're also on Rumble and many other platforms as well. So check us out on those. And we'll be back next week for another Channeled Revelations.